Welcome back to Tech Stack for all you tech enthusiasts. In the previous video, we covered template-driven forms in detail. In this video, we'll cover reactive forms in detail. So first, what is a reactive form? A reactive form is a model-driven approach to handling forms in Angular. The form structure and validation logic are defined entirely in the TypeScript file, not in the HTML. Reactive forms give you more control, better scalability, and predictable state management, which makes them ideal for complex and dynamic forms. That's why reactive forms are widely used in real-world Angular applications. Open the Pages folder in the integrated terminal and create a component for the reactive form. Use the Angular CLI so the component structure is generated automatically. This component will be used to demonstrate reactive forms in Angular, where the form logic lives in the TypeScript file, not the template. Open approutes.ts and add routing for the reactive form component. This makes the reactive form accessible through the application's routing system, keeping navigation clean and consistent with Angular's modern, standalone routing approach. Open app HTML and add a link in the navbar for the reactive form component. This lets us navigate to the reactive form page directly from a UI, instead of typing routes like a machine. Now run the project using ng-serve command. This starts the development server so we can verify that the routing and the reactive form page are working as expected. As you can see, the reactive form component is working properly. The route loads correctly, the component renders without errors, and we're ready to start building the reactive form logic. Before moving ahead, as you know, Angular recently released Angular 21. We are covering Angular 21 from scratch, so if you're a beginner or intermediate, this series will be highly recommended for you. We have also provided the Angular 21 playlist in the description for easy access. Open the reactive form component HTML file. We'll design the form layout using ChatGPT to quickly generate clean, structured HTML, then wire it up with reactive form logic in the component class. Efficient use of tools. We need these fields for our reactive form: name, role, department, salary. These fields will be used to build the form structure in the HTML and will later be connected to the reactive form controls defined in the TypeScript file. Now provide prompt to ChatGPT to design form. Create a simple Bootstrap-based HTML form. Do not include body tag. Use appropriate input fields, textbox, dropdown, and radio. Don't worry, you can find this prompt in the video description. You can copy it directly from there and use it to generate the form HTML without typing everything manually. As you can see, it returned 2 responses, and both contain the form HTML in a really clean, well-structured format. We'll prefer response 1, since it fits our requirements better. Now let's copy that HTML and use it in our reactive form component. In your case, it may return just 1 response, so don't worry. Open the reactive form component HTML file and paste the generated HTML form code. This will render the form in the browser and prepare it for wiring up with reactive form controls in the TypeScript file. As you can see, the form is now displayed in a clean, well-structured layout. Reactive forms are a bit more complex than template-driven forms, which is why most developers prefer reactive forms for larger or dynamic applications. The advantage is that reactive forms provide many features by default, like form control state, validation, and value tracking. Whereas in template-driven forms, you often need to write custom code to achieve the same functionality. In the Components Imports array, add Reactive Forms module. This is required for reactive forms to work. In the case of template-driven forms, we imported Forms module instead. You can find the template form video in the description if you want to compare the two approaches. Now, let's create a reactive form in the component class. This form group will manage the state, value, and validation of all fields in the reactive form. This is how the reactive form is created. Its data type is FormGroup. Now, we'll initialize it in the component, defining all the form controls and their initial values along with validation rules. In our HTML form, we have 4 fields: name, role, department, salary. These will correspond to the form controls we define in the reactive form group. Now, we need to provide form controls for each field in the form group. Each field, name, role, department, and salary, will have its own form control where we can set initial values and validation rules. The value inside the parentheses of form control is the initial or default value for that control. The empty string is the initial value, meaning the field starts empty when the form loads. You can set any default value you want here. Let's provide the form control for the role field in a similar way. Let's provide the form control for the department field in a similar way. Now, let's provide the form control for the salary field in a similar way and initialize it with 0. In reactive forms, we create the form in the component class like this using FormGroup and FormControl. Now, we need to bind this form to the HTML template using FormGroup on the form tag and formControlName on each input field. This connects the form controls in the class with the corresponding input elements in the template. Now, on the form tag, use property binding to bind the form group. We'll assign it the value EMP form from the component class. Now, let's provide formControlName for each input field in the form. This binds each input to its corresponding form control defined in the form group. Here, we've added formControlName to the name field, connecting it directly to the name control in our form group. Now, let's provide formControlName for the remaining fields in a similar way. This binds role, department, and salary inputs to their respective form controls, enabling full reactive form functionality. Notice that in reactive forms, the name attribute is not needed. It was required in template-driven forms, but here it doesn't play any role. The form control binding is handled entirely by formControlName. So far, we've created the reactive form. On the form tag, we added FormGroup binding to the form group defined in the component. Then, on every input element, we added formControlName set to the corresponding property name. This setup connects the template with the reactive form controls, enabling Angular to track values, validation, and state automatically. Now, let's add validation. In template-driven forms, we added validation directly in the HTML using attributes like required or minlength. In reactive forms, validation is defined in the component class when we create each form control. First, let's add validators.required to a form control. This ensures that the name field cannot be left empty, and Angular will mark the control as invalid until a value is entered. Let's add validators .minlength4 to the form control. This ensures that the name must have at least 4 characters, and Angular will automatically track and update the validation state. This is how we add validation in reactive forms. Most of the logic and validation code lives in the component class, while the HTML remains simple and clean with minimal code. This makes reactive forms more scalable and maintainable compared to template-driven forms. Now, we need to show validation messages. In template-driven forms, we use template reference variables to access the state of each control and display errors dynamically. In reactive forms, we handle this differently by accessing the form control from the form group directly in the template. To show validation in a reactive form, we can check the state of a form control using the form group object. This lets us determine if the user has interacted with the field, so we can display validation messages only after the input is touched. This tells us whether the user has changed the value of the field, allowing us to show validation messages only when the input is dirty or touched. Now, let's display the required validation message using Angular 21's if control flow in the template. In span, display the message, "This is required." Now, wrap the validation message in a div with the Bootstrap class text danger to style it in red. Now, let's check the validation. We just touched the name field, but the error didn't appear. That means there might be a mistake in our setup. Let's check the code and fix it. We used formControlName, first letter F with uppercase letters, but it should actually be lowercase. As you can see, now when we touch the name field, the validation message appears perfectly. Now, let's handle the min-length validation using Angular 21's if control flow. This will show the message whenever the name field has fewer than 4 characters, providing dynamic feedback to the user. In span, add error message. Min 4 characters are required. Now, let's check the validation. On page load, you'll notice that the message "This is required" is already showing. Now, let's enter some characters in the name field. You can see that the "This is required" message has disappeared. Now, the min-length message is showing, indicating that the field has some input, but doesn't yet meet the minimum length requirement. Now that we've entered 4 characters, you can see that no validation errors are shown. This confirms that both the required and min-length validations are working correctly in our reactive form. Now, let's disable the Submit button if any required field is not filled. We'll use property binding on the Submit button's disabled property and assign it the form's invalid state. This way, the button stays disabled as long as the form is invalid, ensuring the user cannot submit incomplete or incorrect data. As you can see, The Submit button is now disabled because the required fields are not filled. Now, after entering 4 characters in the name field, you'll see that the Submit button becomes enabled. In template-driven forms, we disabled the Submit button using a template reference variable. Here, in Reactive Forms, we achieve the same result by binding the button's disabled property directly to the form's invalid state. Make sure to practice both template-driven and reactive forms with validations regularly. The more you practice, the more comfortable and experienced you'll become with Angular forms and handling dynamic validations efficiently. If you're passionate about learning new technologies, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Tech Stack, and keep learning new skills. Thank you. And remember, consistency is the key to success.